Since I started this green screen fun where I hold the knife by my face and talk about random books and such, I've had so many people comment like, oh, it's dangerous, he's got a knife near his face. Guys, it's so dull. I can saw my arm and nothing's going to happen. So you're absolutely right. That's boring. That's why today I've brought in a real forged blade that's made out of this kind of metal, and I've been told it's as sharp as a razor. So let's go ahead and just see if that holds up to be true. Yeah, that's pretty damn sharp. So let's make the transition. Remember, children, knives are toys and playing with them is great fun. Kings of the Wyld. So back in my original review, I made quite a bit of a effort to put forward the fact that I believe Kings of the Wyld is one of the most digestible and mass appeal fantasy books ever crafted. You can really recommend this to anyone, not even fantasy fans, and they'll pick it up and be like, oh gosh, that was a wonderful read, and enjoy it. But I didn't take the time to thoroughly hit another point home that I very much so stand by. Because whenever I say something's like mass appeal, like everyone can enjoy it, there's inevitably this like sense of it's not as some intangible form of pretension as good as other books that may not as be mass appealing and widely accepted as great. That's not the case here. Nicholas Eames, to me, has proven something here with Kings of the Wyld, that you can write something that is truly able to be enjoyed by all without sacrificing any of that X factor, something special, something different. And Kings of the Wyld, boy, that's a different boy right there. Yeah, it reads like a D&D campaign where all the players are like super into it and magnificent, but I don't actually love it the more I've thought about that being said about this book, because it sets an expectation of almost sloppiness, and there is nothing sloppy about this story. Kings of the Wyld is actually a very tight and well-crafted narrative once you reread it, which I've done now for this video. There's no fat. It's pretty lean, actually, and I think that actually works extraordinarily well with the overall philosophy behind this, which, without a doubt, this is a love letter to fantasy as a whole that doesn't really necessarily have a high bar for entry for non-fantasy fans, because it takes the time. While these are elements of fantasy that giant fantasy fans will enjoy, they're not so central or integral that you can't just be a fan of the narrative being told underneath. Alright, let's go ahead and talk about what exactly Kings of the Wyld is. We have our band of mercenaries who take up jobs and go off and fight to do cool, like, slow hand hitting people with his shield stuff. And that's, you know, a cool setting already. Mercenaries have an appeal for a reason. But this story does not take place in their prime. No. In fact, this band is retired. They're all older men here, which, thank you, Nicholas, for fighting back against the ageism that takes place within fantasy. Just because you're no longer in your 20s doesn't mean you can't go on some fun adventures. But one of the band members' daughter is trapped in a siege where death is a certainty, and this band gets back together once again to go on tour and save her. Now, why did I say tour? Well, that's because Nicholas Eames has stated many times, even in the interview I had with him here on the channel, that he is inspired by old rock bands for these mercenary bands that are a huge part of the fantastical world he is playing. And there's another element here which I really think Nicholas Eames took advantage of to a fantastic extent, and that is relying on what is known for fantasy, even outside of tight fantasy circles, for his world building. So while there is a well-realized fantasy world here, he didn't have to devote a ton of his time to building a lot that's new, and instead, almost all of his great effort goes into realizing these characters, their personality, and the journey itself they go on. He also has the typical hero's journey where you have your big bad, your low axe, your high axe, all these things that, you know, you're not going to be blown out of the water in that sense. But again, I don't like that when people hear that, they immediately have this like negative taste in their mouth where it's like, oh, it's using those tropes. No, I don't like it. Well, if you're saying that you've never liked these things that your typical hero's journey does, then you're saying you don't like Star Wars and stuff like that. And I'm talking the original Star Wars. And then you're just a party pooper and you suck. Because you can use these typical beats to still do something very different. And that's where Kings of the Wyld thrives. I heard a lot about this book before going in, but it made me just kind of expect almost a just pure fun roller coaster ride, nothing of real depth here. There are emotional depths realized in this story purely through the character work and relationship work that's going on that hit harder than almost any moments in series that are 10 books long, 1,000-page tomes,
book after book.
Because Nicholas Eames wanted to make you connect with this band, feel like you're a member of it as they go on their journey. And because he succeeds in that, even the few people I've seen that really didn't like this book as much will still admit that they felt like they were in this group. They are a part of this journey. So we're going off on a rescue mission here. There's trials and tribulations of getting the band back together. The chemistry's not what it once was. They're a little bit older, not the top of their craft. And there's these young, upstart mercenary groups who aren't achieving what the old mercenary groups once did. See how like the music parallels continue on? It's actually a really nice theme that never pulls you out of the book, but almost just makes what's occurring more understandable because this reflection exists. Another thing Nicholas Eames just knocked out of the park. And as you go on this rescue mission though with these characters and you go from beat after beat, inevitably you fall in love with this group. Not even just because they're well realized and they have a phenomenal relationship with each other and the chemistry grows very naturally and smoothly within the pages, but in addition to that, there's so many angles here to this party that aren't going to be like what you typically have in modern fantasy. One, there's the age, where I actually really connect with these guys because they're not feeling like they're in their prime and they're a bit older and they're going up against these younger fighters. For some reason, that's just like something you fall into. You kind of feel the humanity there. And with our main protagonist, who in a lesser story, I would say, would be the father of the girl who's taken. But no, he's just the de facto leader of the group, and it's another member of the group whose daughter's been taken, which gives you an angle of he's here just because he's a really good friend and guy. He had a nice life set up. He could have just said, no, I'm not going to help you. This is a suicide mission, and moved on. But he's here with his friends because he loves them, and he knows if it was his daughter, he would do anything to save her. And that's Slow Hand, one of my favorite fantasy characters I read last year. I'm kind of fleshing out my fantasy tattoos on my arm, and I'm eventually going to get his shield. That's one that I'm just like, hells yeah. But Nick, I need you to give me exactly here's what Slow Hand's shield is for me to do that. So just putting that out there.
Yeah, dude, it's a wooden shield. It's a shield that's made of a piece of wood.
I was in the middle of making this video and I legit just messaged Nick like, hey, you want to help me make this really bad joke? And he was like, sure, right away. So he's also a really great dude, and go ahead and follow him on Twitter right there. It was really funny to me. Every member of this party stands out and has the emotional depth and relatability that Slow Hand does with his great sacrifice for the group and continual badassery that still never feels like over-the-top Die Hard 6 explosion, plane into a helicopter. No, it's a human guy who just happens to be really good at hitting and getting hit. But other members of the group are phenomenal. Moog, one of my favorite chaotic wizard types I've read in ages. He's just insane, he's gay, he's wonderful, and I love him. Oh, he's fantastic. You got your big bad, you got your band's accomplishments, rock star, rocking out, humans past their prime, going on an adventure that's basically a suicide mission to save one man's girl, that's his daughter. Do I need to spell it out more why this kind of hits home so hard? The father-daughter dynamic? Talk about an instant emotional impact. I just remembered that in these before you reads, I do some ratings. This is totally not a reshoot. Let's get into these ratings, man. First rating, how magical is Kings of the Wyld? Magic's pretty prevalent here. It's heavily influenced by D&D and stuff like that. It's not in every single page, like on that Dresden level, but I'd put it a solid 7 out of 10. We got a lot of magical usage going on here. It's pretty prevalent. Now, in terms of, okay, how violent is Kings of the Wyld? I have a hard time putting an exact pin in that, because Kings of the Wyld is pretty freaking violent, but it's not presented in a grimdark way by any means. So for this one, I'm gonna do a 6. Even though it's prevalent, it's just not like the most gory violence of all time. And I will note that there are injuries here. It plays into the fact that they are older, these people take damage and it affects them. But on top of that, there's just a more realistic approach of if someone's hit, they're hit. It's not like a lot of these times where someone gets shivved, 400,000 times, and then they get up and they're like, I'm the chosen one, I'm okay. No, if someone takes a hit, they take a hit here. So it's kind of on a strange positioning, but it's not gruesome to read. So I'm gonna just label it like a 6 here. In terms of the fantastical elements in the world, what I really like about Kings of the Wyld is how traditional fantasy it feels, yet it very frequently is pulling from like more niche things within fantasy, which shoots it way up here. I think the fantastical elements here are utilized brilliantly. So I'm gonna go ahead and put it a solid 8. If you can bring in an owl bear, I'm happy. And some things really do stand out and give it its own personality, like airships are a thing in this world, even though it seems very like not advanced enough for that, but you know, it's used to good effect. So I really enjoy the fantastical elements, and it's not a full-on 10 out of 10 like Silmarillion level, but it's thoroughly fantasy. There's also a place called the Wyld here, which I really enjoy, and I think notches up the fantasy a little bit for me, where there's these like whole section where all the mythical beasts go, and the bands go in there to hunt prey and prove themselves in the wild. That's fantastic. In terms of lore though, that's one of the things where it's actually going to come down a couple notches for me. Let's have the blade face that while I do that with my hands. Because pretty much everything I've said here is most of the lore you're going to get here. It's not the most lore-rich fantasy experience, so I'm actually going to put that as like a 3. I do think the lore that's there is solid, but it's just not a whole lot. Remember, this kind of rating, it's not quality, it's just amount I'm rating. Quality for Kings of the Wyld for all this stuff, we'll just go watch my review. All right, I'm going to slow it down here, because we talked about a lot of the just like, wow, it's awesome appeal, but I want to get into more of like the actual like subtle detail here. The pacing is immaculate. I don't think there's a slow moment in this whole story. They just hit interesting point after interesting point, and there's always character work being done and relationship work, so you just flow through the pages. Without getting into spoilers, the climax is over the top and bombastic, but it just works because of the tone of the story, and this tone is one of absurdity and humor with a strong underlying foundation of heart, if you haven't picked up what I'm putting down yet. And that blend, I think everyone can connect with very strongly. So one of the main reasons I'm making this video though is because in my review, I did do a glowing review because this is one of my favorite reads of 2019, but I just want to emphasize that this isn't watered down or somehow less because it has that mass appeal I was talking about. Believe it or not, the mass audiences can enjoy something that's fantastic, and Kings of the Wyld somehow found this magical balance and blend of being so digestible, so consumable by anybody, yet not any form of less. It's not some diet, it's not some soda nothingness. It's the perfect blend of like a protein shake that actually tastes good. There's sustenance, there's depth, there's a healthy underlying of lessons to be taken away, and a fantastic level of representation across the band and full cast, while also just, for completing the metaphor, tasting good. So to have some form of like structured conclusion to this video, because I know I often just like ramble and then end it, which is not the best for like YouTube analytics. Kings of the Wyld for me is actually something I'm putting in the must-read category for like, if you share a taste with mine, pick it up. Not only because this book is fantastic, the next book, Bloody Rose, I would say is almost as solid on all fronts. I've known it to actually make several people who have read it cry.
Yeah, I cried. I'm still crying, and I'll probably cry again.
Which, again, with everything I've said here, isn't something you'd probably expect. But this is just a series that, for me, it's like the ultimate palate cleanser. And palate cleanser, once again, doesn't mean somehow less. There's still as much to take away and enjoy. It's just in a current state and day and age where fantasy is trying so much and the page counts are ever getting higher and higher. Nicholas Eames has proved you don't need 700 pages to tell a phenomenal story with characters you'll remember forever and accomplish exactly what you intend to as an author. And from what I've talked to Nick and taken away from, what he wanted to do was craft a love letter for fantasy. By God, he did it. So I just wanted to try another kind of type of the before you read video, and I actually changed the title of this series to be like not why you should read but before you read, so I could get into some negatives, but I just don't have solid negatives to get into for Kings of the Wyld. It's not like my favorite book of all time, but it definitely reaches into that it's solid across the categories. I'd have to nitpick, and I'm not here to nitpick. I'm here to tell you that this is one of my favorite reads of 2019. It is something that just consistently people I know who have picked it up have loved it, and I recommend you do so as well. Let me know what you think of Kings of the Wyld in the comments down below. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Get your heart on your sleeve, because it's okay to do so, and get ready to have some tears in your eyes if you continue on to Bloody Rose. Have a good one, y'all. Peace! And of course, I'd like to record a special shout out to my latest high tier Patreon, Dana Salinger. Hope you're doing well, Dana.